In the summer of 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt went on a 3-day camping trip with the naturalist vagabond John Muir in California's Yosemite Valley. They hiked toward one of America's most beautiful landscapes and sat around the campfire talking for hours. This became the most important camping trip in the history of conservation, as it propelled Roosevelt to go on a mission saving more land and natural wonders than any other person in human history at the time. Land that might otherwise have been developed or put to the axe. But why would Roosevelt take such drastic action after a camping trip and use his powers for such a cause? Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. What grabs your eye in this photo? The magnificent and commanding Roosevelt? The more mild John Muir, his impressive beard? Or like me, are your eyes drawn to the periphery and the background and to the natural beauty that they stood against? This photo was taken on that famous camping trip with John Muir and President Roosevelt at Yosemite Valley as they stood here at Glacier Point. Maybe already you can see what could have driven Roosevelt to take action on that trip to save this beautiful place. But we're going to dig deeper. But before we get knee deep in the mud of history, our exploration question for today's story lecture is, what impact did Roosevelt's camping trip with John Muir have on his presidency and his commitment to conserve America's natural resources? And what other impacts did his progressive reforms have? So let's get digging, guys. We got some history to shovel. Theodore Roosevelt was a born naturalist who had an affinity for nature and adventure since he was a child. But he was actually a sickly kid who struggled mightily with asthma and spent days on end in his bed, too weak to get up. But with guidance and support from his father, whom he loved and admired dearly, he learned to battle against the weakness within him. And throughout his whole life, he seemed to muscle against any shortcomings and to put his whole character on the line to prove his strength and manliness, maybe to the point of stupidity. But heck, I love it. He once delivered a speech on the need to embrace danger and turbulence in the battle to win manly achievements after he was shot in the chest and was still carrying the bullet of the would-be assassin, before fainting and then being rushed to get medical attention. And earlier, when he was Secretary of the Navy, a position of considerable authority, he stepped down when the nation went to war with Spain, and he raised a volunteer fighting force of cowboys and athletes that included blacks and Native Americans as well to fight against the Spanish in Cuba. And Roosevelt led the daring charge, full steam into enemy fire during the Battle of San Juan Hill. His heroics made him a beloved national figure, but he had made many enemies in the political world, with Democrats and with his own Republicans as well. You see, he was rising in political power during the Gilded Age. In the era of machine corruption, Roosevelt was an independent-minded reformer who had little patience for those he felt were misusing their power for their own benefit. When he was newly elected to the New York legislature, Roosevelt was bumping heads with experienced and hard-nosed politicians from Tammany Hall, who didn't like the new reformer in their ranks, and upon hearing news that Big John McManus, a former heavyweight boxer and about 100 pounds bigger than the young Roosevelt was at the time, was going to rough him up with some of his boys, Roosevelt cornered him, and with neck veins bulging and speaking and spitting through clenched teeth, he said, "By God, McManus, I hear you're going to toss me in a blanket. If you try anything like that, I'll kick you, I'll bite you, I'll kick you in the balls. I'll do anything. You better leave me alone." You gotta love it.
So his own party didn't like him, even though he was popular and probably helped him out a lot? Why wouldn't his own people support him?
Great question, Manao. You see, political parties are organizations that have agendas and goals, and not everyone in the party feels exactly the same on every issue. And Roosevelt was a Republican, but a new kind of Republican, and had many ideas that worried people in his own party. So when he came home a national hero from the war, the Republican Party establishment was worried sick that this young cowboy and now celebrity would make a run for the White House and become president. So party leaders devised a plan. They could use Roosevelt's popularity to help a machine man, McKinley, win the election for presidency and keep Roosevelt as vice president, where he would have no real power and no real authority because the VP is kind of a worthless job. And Roosevelt did just that. McKinley won a handsome victory with Roosevelt on the ticket as vice president, but when McKinley was assassinated just a year into his term, the man who was never supposed to be president, this reckless cowboy and a dangerous reformer, was thrust into the power of the presidency and quickly grew a liking for that power. And Roosevelt sought to use it in an entirely new way in American history. And in the midst of Roosevelt's presidency, developments that had been taking place for generations were speeding up, and it was putting some of America's greatest treasures at risk. The openness and sheer scope of America's beautiful landscapes had always made an impression on the American psyche and mindset. Our first unique artist came from the Hudson Valley School in the mid-1800s that, unlike the esteemed portraits of Renaissance Europe, painted the beauty of America herself. From Niagara Falls to the open plains and everything in between, Americans had pride in their country's vast open land and abundant resources. But Americans had historically also had a drive to use those resources and believed in improving upon nature. They ripped up natural grasses to plant wheat, corn, and cotton. They cleared forests to plant cash crops and raise cattle, and blew away mountainsides to mine silver, copper, and gold. And as the country industrialized with aggression, the speed and scope of development led John Muir to devote his life to preserving the wild spaces of America. He was a Scottish immigrant who was brought to America as a child and raised in Wisconsin, where he too was touched early by the beauty of America. And as steel, concrete, and cities grew at astonishing speed, Muir tried to lead a counter-revolution against the Industrial Revolution that saw nature not as something to be harvested for profits, but as a treasure itself to be honored, preserved, and enjoyed for its own sake. As America's #1 naturalist, Roosevelt wrote to him as president, asking him to be his guide in Yosemite Valley that had been so long Muir's home, saying, "I don't want anyone with me but you, and I want to drop politics absolutely for 4 days and just be out in the open with you." And in 1903, they finally met outside the valley. Muir was not much for politics, but realized if he could make an impression on the president, or better yet, if the valley itself could, his dream of saving Yosemite forever from the axe and steel might be realized. Muir stated, "I might be able to do some forest good in freely talking about the campfire," because he knew and understood that Roosevelt was already making unprecedented moves as president, and maybe he could usher in even more. Roosevelt really was a new type of president in a new century, at the dawn of a new age. He had the energy and charisma to match the moment, and the courage to take back the reins of power in the country that had been for a generation really in the hands of big business. The trusts and industrialists that had dominated the economy were for some time now seen as above the law, and even beyond the grasp and reach of the president. But Roosevelt was intent on reining them in, taking executive action against any trust that he felt unfairly controlled the market or misused their power. Roosevelt was dubbed the Trust Buster, and that was the name of his first hip-hop album. No, I'm kidding, but that would be pretty cool. But really, the first trust that Roosevelt took on was owned by the nation's wealthiest banker and one of the most powerful people in the world, J.P. Morgan. Taking action against Morgan's Northern Security Company that controlled nearly all the railroads in the North, Roosevelt broke up that trust and showed the country and the business leaders that even the richest man would not live outside or above the law. And eventually, Roosevelt broke up 44 trusts as president. However, he only took action against those trusts that he deemed were bad trusts, who he felt misused their power, and left alone other trusts regardless if they were technically still illegal, so long as they were using their power for good, which was not entirely constitutional, but Roosevelt felt he could be the judge of that. Roosevelt was also the first president to side with unions and workers during a strike. Previously, pretty much all governors and presidents had sided with the owners against the strikers and used force to stop them. But during the Pennsylvania coal strike that was leading to a national emergency as winter set in, Roosevelt sided with the strikers and the workers and told the owners that if they didn't agree to some of the terms of the strikers, that he would nationalize the mine and send in the National Guard to mine the coal. Again, although this was entirely unconstitutional, Roosevelt's threats eventually led to a settlement, getting a raise in pay and reduced hours for the strikers, and they returned to work feeling that they had an ally in the White House, and Roosevelt's popularity grew with the working men and women in the country. Roosevelt also took action to protect consumers from dangerous practices and products. After reading the muckraking novel The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, Roosevelt, like millions of Americans, was absolutely aghast and horrified to learn about the horrendous conditions in the slaughterhouses that provided the nation with much of their meat supply. Here, Sinclair describes some of the common practices in industrial meat production. There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor, in the dirt and sawdust. There would be meat stored in great piles in the rooms, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. This is no fairy story and no joke. The meat would be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat even when he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poisoned rat was a tidbit.
Come on, Mr. Luer. Sinclair was exaggerating here. I mean, I'm a hardened cynic and I can't imagine it could have been that bad. What's up?
Mahina, that's exactly what Roosevelt himself thought as he read it, but sometimes history is stranger and darker than fiction. And after finishing his mountain of morning bacon, he went on to sign the Meat Inspection Act to send in federal regulators into meat plants, and surprisingly found Sinclair's jungle to be all too accurate. And then Roosevelt signed the Pure Food and Drug Act that regulated the safety of medicine and food. And these actions made up 2 of the 3 C's that categorized Roosevelt's progressive agenda. Control of corporations, which was his breaking up of trusts. Consumer protections, which was like the Meat Inspection Act. And what might be his most important legacy, conservation of resources, which was about to be impacted by 3 of the best nights of his life in Yosemite Valley. When Muir met with Roosevelt at Yosemite Valley on May 15, 1903, it was a meeting of the most popular person in America with the nation's leading naturalist, in a time when it was far from cool, popular, or even pretentious to be a tree-hugging environmentalist. Muir took Roosevelt on hikes around Yosemite's most beautiful areas, Sentinel Dome, Glacier Point, El Capitan, and saw native birds and gushing waterfalls, and stood under the great sequoias and gazed over miles of valleys and the endless Sierra Nevada mountains. The first night when they were camping it had begun to snow, and Muir worried it might sour the mood of the president as temperature dropped and inches fell. But Roosevelt had brought 40 blankets and was not one to be easily spoiled by some inclement weather. The next morning he was up early, drank what looked like a gallon of coffee, and then toured miles of valley on horseback. And it was that second night around the campfire for hours on end that the 2 sat and talked. In their discussion, Muir spoke of the absolute necessity of using federal action to protect Yosemite and other natural treasures from lumbermen and developers. And in the wee hours of the night, these 2 men hashed out the future of America's National Park Service. Roosevelt left the trip saying to a reporter who asked him about it, "It was bully. I had the time of my life." And Roosevelt returned to Washington with a determination and a spirit to go all in on conservation. He signed the Antiquities Act, which gave the president power to create national monuments on federal lands. He then went on to save 147 million acres of forest reserves, 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 55 bird and wildlife sanctuaries, and 150 national forests. And these 2 men helped to change the culture in America, that today we have such pride in our open and wild spaces, and as Muir called them, the temples of nature. And just as Europeans guard and protect their castles and cathedrals, America guards our wilderness and our parks. And just as the Declaration and the Constitution serve as a birthright to future generations, so too will Yosemite and Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon and so many more. And with a warming planet and a myriad of environmental problems facing land, sea, and air, I fear as we Americans turn more and more towards screens and phones and virtual environments, that we might neglect our open spaces and our duty to protect them. So I challenge you to find some open spaces and to get lost in them soon. Because as John Muir stated, of all the paths you take in life, make sure a few of them are dirt. So go uphold your civic duty and get dirty. Thanks for engaging in history today. This has been History for Humans. But before you close your screens and go off into the wild and get dirty, if you enjoyed this lesson, it would be great if you liked and showed it and subscribed and all that other stuff. And if you want, head over to our website where we have forums for students to engage with one another and join the conversation. And we also got quick instructions for a learning activity that's coming up next. All right, guys, I think you're really going to enjoy the lesson that we got for you today. First part, you're going to read a primary source. It's one of Theodore Roosevelt's great speeches. It was Conservation as a National Duty. And you're going to read just a few paragraphs of that awesome speech. You're going to answer a few questions, just making sure you comprehend and then analyze and then connect with the text. And then the second part, which you guys are going to enjoy even more, I believe, is that you get to redesign the National Park Service's logo. So you're going to be able to first look at the present logo, which is the arrowhead with the bison and the sequoia tree with the mountains and the lakes. You're going to learn about what each part of that logo symbolizes, and then you're going to create your own logo, what you think is going to be a great way to show people the treasures that are our national parks. And as you design it, think about what symbols you're going to use and what those symbols represent. Okay, it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to be a great artist to do this. Sometimes simplicity is best, and it's important that you just put in your best effort, think creatively, think originally. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you guys next time.